Welcome back again. Please comment down below where you are right now and what time it is currently, and also press the like button. Sherri Rasmussen lay beaten and shot in her living room, a quiet apartment disturbed into chaos. A burglary, staged, except for one intimate detail. A bite mark, swabbed, sealed, and stored. Decades later, an LAPD detective lifted a paper cup, took a sip, and set it down. A covert team watched, waiting. How did a detective become a suspect, and why did it take so long? A family's grief, institutional blind spots, and a chilling mystery inside the LAPD. To understand what was lost, we need to go back to who Sherri was. She was an ICU nurse, the kind of leader who ran toward alarms when others hesitated. Colleagues described her as organized, disciplined, and calm under pressure, a presence that stabilized fractured moments. She completed advanced certifications early, mentored younger nurses, and set standards quietly through practice. The psychology of the moment is important. Caregiving at that level isn't just skill, it's endurance, and it shapes how someone moves through the world. Alert, empathetic, vigilant. She met John Ruetten through friends, and their relationship moved fast, not reckless but confident. John was a successful engineer, steady, affable, someone who got along with almost everyone. There was history, though, that trailed him into the future. A college romance with Stephanie Lazarus. It was on again, off again, the kind of relationship that never fully ended because it fractured slowly rather than breaking clean. They had stayed in touch after graduation, tried to reframe themselves as friends. In hindsight, that friendship invited ambiguity, and ambiguity encourages hope or entitlement, depending on who's holding on. When John got serious with Sherri, Lazarus didn't just fade into the background. She appeared, often, just close enough to signal presence. She was then a young LAPD officer, smart, ambitious, physically capable, already embedded in a culture that valued confidence and decisiveness. And yet, for all this, what stands out now, in retrospect, is that boundary lines didn't hold. Early friction surfaced in places that should have been neutral. Lazarus went to Sherri's workplace, a medical environment where Sherri had authority. According to later accounts, she asked to talk, tested the edges of Sherri's patience, and left a residue of discomfort. Why go there? Proximity is leverage. Catching someone at work turns a private triangle into a public pressure point. The confrontation at the condo door came later. Sherri answered, and Lazarus stood there. The conversation turned sharp. Sherri, unsettled, told her family afterward that the ex-girlfriend wouldn't let go. That statement matters. It captures fear in a sentence, and it frames the dynamic. One woman building a life, the other pressing for a different outcome. The psychology is simple, but not simplistic. Jealousy, loss, control. Sherri and John married anyway. They set routines, moved in, tried to stabilize the edges. She was careful with security, but apartments are porous. Shared hallways, predictable parking, habits visible to neighbors. John traveled for work. Shifts at the hospital ran late. The rhythms of their life were public enough to map. Vulnerabilities weren't dramatic, just ordinary. That's how most people live. There are micro-stories that illustrate the pressure. Sherri calling her parents late one night, asking if she was overreacting to an unexpected encounter. Her father, Nels, urging caution while trying not to inflame her anxiety. John, caught between history and commitment, still answering calls from Lazarus, telling himself it was about closure, not invitation. That's not a moral failing. It's a common misread of emotional gravity. Meanwhile, Lazarus navigated the police world, a space with camaraderie, competition, and informal networks that conferred status. What if she interpreted access as permission? What if colleagues, without meaning harm, normalized persistence as professional resolve rather than personal intrusion? The blending of identities, officer, ex, friend, created cover, and what nobody knew at the time was how damaging that blend could become when resentment hardened. Wedding photos went into frames, a quilted blanket draped over a couch, mundane and comforting. Sherri trained new nurses, wrote schedules on a kitchen calendar, and noted pharmacy refill dates. John jogged, lifted weights, and checked in with college friends. They were making a life. But here's the twist. Those ordinary details would later be reinterpreted as evidence of pattern, of access, of risk. The door confrontation lingered in Sherri's body language. She kept blinds angled differently. She locked the door twice. She told John that Lazarus's presence felt deliberate, not accidental. He reassured her. But reassurance doesn't change behavior if the external pressure remains. This is where the human element matters. Sherri wanted to believe in everyday safety. She also understood escalation. In intimate partner violence, even when the partner is past, the possessive thinking can persist. 3 small moments stand out. First, a voicemail left on a day Sherri worked back-to-back shifts. Lazarus asking John to meet, coded as friendly, timed when Sherri couldn't intervene. Second, a run-in at a gym, quick and strained, where Lazarus's tone was flat, investigative, and John tried to keep it light. Third, Sherri telling a co-worker that an ex of John's had shown up at their place. The co-worker remembers the phrase, "won't let go," because it was said quietly, like a warning to herself. And then there was the calendar week of February 1986. Sherri had a leadership meeting, a morning off planned to catch up on domestic tasks, and John had early obligations. They discussed errands the night before, bank deposit, a return, and a plan to stay home. It was winter-spring Los Angeles, bright mornings, cool evenings. Nothing about the plan felt risky. They were doing what couples do, organizing hours, sharing small burdens. The morning of February 24th began routine. John left for work. Sherri, home, considered going to her hospital meeting, then decided to stay back. Some accounts suggest she planned to reschedule. Phone calls stopped mid-morning. A neighbor heard a thud but couldn't place it. In missing person cases, silence is usually gradual. Here, the silence was sudden. Hours later, it would be broken by a door opening onto a living room that no longer looked like theirs. John unlocked the door and stepped into a living room that looked ransacked, but not lived in anymore. Cushions tossed, drawers pulled, a TV cabinet open, cords dangling. A VCR was gone. A few items seemed missing, but the arrangement was unusual and unsettling. Stereo components stacked near the door as if someone had planned to haul them, then changed their mind. He called out, once, twice. No answer. Then he saw her on the carpet, a quilt missing from the couch, the air heavy with a metallic trace that never leaves memory. Police responded to what was broadcast as a possible burglary turned violent. The initial visual survey matched the label, forced chaos, scattered belongings, a broken window in the sliding glass door. But what stands out now in retrospect is that the glass lay more inside than out, the pattern suggesting the pane had been struck from within or pulled after the fact, not shattered by an intruder breaking in. Burglars do not usually tidy their exit wounds. They do not arrange. Sherri's body told the story of a struggle. Autopsy later documented blunt force trauma to the head and face, consistent with a heavy object, possibly a ceramic vase or similar household item that had shattered nearby. 3 gunshot wounds were identified, 2 to the chest, 1 overlapping an earlier track, indicating re-aiming during movement. The ballistics suggested a .38 caliber revolver. Revolvers do not leave shell casings on the floor, which aligns with what the scene showed. No ejected brass, no quick trail to follow. Blood spatter analysis mapped the conflict across rooms. Upstairs, in the bedroom area, there were drag marks and transfer patterns along the railing. A smear on the banister told investigators the fight started high and moved low, a descent shaped by pushing, grappling, and resistance. On the stair edge, there was an imprint from a socked heel, Sherri likely bracing, trying to plant and hold. Downstairs, near the entryway, larger pools formed, then narrowed into satellite specks near where she fell. The psychology of the moment is important. This was not a calm execution. It was intimate, sustained, furious. Near the body, a piece of woven fabric fiber matched the missing quilted blanket from the couch. That blanket would matter. 1 bullet path showed a muted entrance profile, consistent with a makeshift suppressor or a soft barrier placed between muzzle and target. Investigators considered that a blanket had been wrapped around the firearm to muffle sound and catch powder residue or exiting debris. In homicide staging, a blanket can function as a bullet catcher and sound dampener, but its absence afterward raised a question. Who takes the blanket? Someone who came prepared to control noise, or someone improvising within a familiar space? Then there was the bite mark. On the inner forearm, fresh, bruised, with visible dental impressions. Bites in violent struggles are rare for opportunistic burglaries, and when they happen, they tend to be defensive. A victim biting an assailant to break free. This was the opposite. A perpetrator biting the victim. It pointed to rage, to humiliation, to a need to dominate. The forensic team did something that would preserve the future. A swab of the bite area, carefully collected and preserved in cold storage. At the time, DNA testing was not what it would become, but the habit of preserving everything saved the case later. As detectives worked the room, They catalogued the ransacked look. Jewelry boxes overturned, yet valuable pieces remained. A closet door was left open, but the most expensive garments were not taken. The stereo stack looked staged, elements unplugged but set down gently, edges aligned. It did not read like a hurried sweep. It read like someone trying to paint a scene. Unknown to them, across town, a burglary crew had been active in recent weeks. Pattern pressure can be powerful. When a city has a series of break-ins, the next mess gets filed under the same header. 2 men had been reported in the neighborhood, one on a bike, another seen cutting through a parking area. Those sightings entered the conversation early, and with weight, shaping what evidence would be emphasized and what would be sidelined. And yet, for all this, the personal nature of the violence kept intruding. Consider the living room table. On it, a coffee mug with lipstick remnants, but Sherri was not wearing lipstick that morning, according to her routine. Could that have transferred earlier? Yes, but here is the twist. There were no latent prints lifted that tied strangers to the mug or the electronics. The absence of foreign prints is not proof of familiarity, but it moves the needle. The staircase wall showed impact marks at shoulder height. Forensic technicians measured paint transfers and height profiles to reconstruct body positions. Sherri was tall, athletic. The attacker had to match her force long enough to overpower her, and the pattern suggested bursts of contact, followed by repositioning. In the kitchen, a drawer was open. Utensils, not knives. No kitchen knife was used. The gun was brought in, not taken from the home. That matters, because burglars usually do not bring firearms to shoot residents. They bring them to threaten and flee. Here, the gun became the centerpiece of the assault. Neighbors reported hearing a scream, then a loud thud, then something like dull pops, muffled, not sharp. One neighbor thought it was a car backfiring on the street. If the blanket served as a sound barrier, it would explain the confusion. For detectives, this should have highlighted premeditation, or at least expectation of violence. Instead, it was filed as a risk escalation by startled burglars. The narrative locked early. On the upstairs vanity, a smudge of blood with a curved edge suggested a ring had pressed into skin during the struggle. Wedding rings cut into people when fists clench. That detail, minor as it is, keeps the human element present. She fought. She tried to hold on to her life, to this home, to the routine that was supposed to be safe. In hindsight, the scene read like a confrontation between 2 people with history, not an interruption by strangers. Evidence technicians packaged swabs, bagged fibers, photographed every angle, and dusted the entertainment center. They measured the broken glass, logged its distribution, and noted the clean edges of the slider frame. Forced entry should show prying, splintering, or glass patterns that radiate outward from an external impact. Here, the lines did not match perfectly. It was close, but close is where staging hides. The .38 caliber conclusion came from wound channel width and ballistic deformation. Without casings, they could not tie a specific weapon, and no firearm was recovered. Later, that absence would echo in another way: service weapons, private handguns, and logs that would require careful cross-checking. But at the time, the missing gun was just another gap. Before the body was transported, the coroner investigator noted the bite, directed the swab, and sealed it. One detail that would matter decades later: sitting in a small tube, silent. The scene, on paper, settled into a theory. Burglary interrupted, struggle escalated, shots fired, a window broken, property taken, case direction set. Detectives chose the narrative: burglars, not jealousy. And once that choice was made, the staging cues, the blanket, the bite, the personal rage, all became anomalies to explain away rather than signals to follow. From the first briefing, the case file tilted. Patrol notes highlighted the ransacked room, the missing VCR, the broken slider. Detectives were told about 2 men, reportedly seen in the area that week, connected loosely to a burglary pattern. The logic was quick, almost comforting. A home invasion interrupted, a resident fights, chaos ends in gunfire. It fit a template everyone recognized in 1980s Los Angeles, property crime turning lethal. But here is the twist. The intimate markers did not fit. The bite was personal, humiliating, a sign of control, not opportunism. The blanket's disappearance hinted at an intentional sound barrier. The broken glass pattern looked wrong. Still, the burglary hypothesis stayed on top, and every detail got filtered through it. That is confirmation bias. A story chosen first, then evidence arranged to support it. In hindsight, this is the moment everything changed. Nels and Loretta Rasmussen, bewildered and grieving, told investigators something else. Sherri had been afraid of a woman, an ex-girlfriend of John's, a police officer who had visited and would not let go. They did not name her at first for the record, but they asked the obvious question, could this be personal? The psychology of the moment is important. Families are often dismissed as emotional, but they carry context investigators do not have. They knew about the workplace visit, the door confrontation, the warnings said in a low voice after dinner. Detectives documented the family's concerns in early notes, according to later accounts, but those concerns did not drive the case. No formal recorded interview with the ex-girlfriend appears in the main file from that period. The reason matters. Internal deference in a large department can be subtle. When a potential subject has a badge, colleagues hesitate, even unconsciously. They tell themselves it is about fairness, not favoritism. They worry about careers, reputations, morale, and yet, for all this, avoiding a clean interview meant the most obvious alternative narrative never got real oxygen. Meanwhile, the two men lead gathered momentum. A composite was discussed. The area had reported break-ins by a small crew entering through sliders and back windows, grabbing electronics and moving fast. The problem, which should have been obvious, was the violence profile. These burglars ran at signs of occupants. Here, the offender stayed, fought, and overpowered a trained, athletic woman, then staged property for show. Investigators considered the possibility of a panicked escalation, but that did not address the bite, the blanket, or the missing weapon brought to the scene by the offender. Evidence that contradicted the chosen story got nudged to the margins. The stereo stack aligned neatly near the door. They were interrupted mid-removal. The blanket gone, taken with other property. The glass mostly inside. Glass can fall inward depending on angle. Each explanation plausible in isolation, less persuasive in combination. This is how erasure works in a case file. Nothing is overtly falsified. Instead, inconvenient pieces get explained away until they stop demanding attention. Inside the department, pressures weighed on detectives. Clearance rates mattered. Burglary turned homicide cases, when linked to active crews, offered a path. Find the ring, tie them in, and the case closes with the city a little safer. Cross-checking an Officer X, however, threatened an internal storm. Supervisors alerted, union questions, departmental politics. Even if no one directly said, do not, the path of least resistance was clear. Proceed with the burglary angle. Family pushback continued. Nels wrote notes, pressed for updates, questioned assumptions. He was told they were pursuing leads. He asked about the ex. He felt stonewalled. Loretta recorded phone calls on a home recorder to preserve timelines. They were not trying to be adversarial. They were trying to keep their daughter from becoming a statistic in an overworked system. But grief often gets coded as interference. The quieter message to the family was, trust the process. Within months, the file grew thicker but not deeper. Property lists refined, pawn shops canvassed, informants asked about electronics. The two-men narrative remained dominant. An entry in an early log allegedly referenced ex-girlfriend cop, according to later testimony, but that reference did not anchor the case plan. As years passed, some early notes would no longer appear in the main investigative packet. Whether misfiled or separated for sensitivity, the effect was the same. The most dangerous lead lost proximity to the core. What stands out now, in retrospect, is that the bite mark was preserved but not prioritized. In the mid-1980s, DNA as we know it was not available for routine casework, but the forensic value of saliva was understood in principle. A bite, especially by a female perpetrator, would have shattered the burglary story. Still, the case did not pivot to wait for science. It drifted, then settled. Cold cases rarely freeze overnight. They cool by degrees, as new crimes pull attention, as team members transfer, as institutional memory thins. Inside LAPD culture at the time, informal networks carried weight. Detectives traded favors, shared tips, and protected each other from unnecessary embarrassment. That culture builds loyalty, but it can also build blind spots. Interviewing a colleague about a homicide connected to a romantic triangle was a career landmine. Better to explore external suspects, follow the burglary crew, file the report. The psychology of the investigator becomes part of the crime scene, risk management guiding curiosity. Meanwhile, small pieces suggested personal targeting, the absence of sexual assault indicators, the directness of the violence, the household objects used in anger between gunshots. These mirrored intimate partner violence patterns, even if the partner was not the husband. Jealousy-based homicides often lean on overkill, on face blows, on humiliation. A burglar's motive is simple: get in, get out, avoid contact. This attacker engaged, chased, punished, then tried to make it look random. In the Rasmussen home, the calendar still hung on the kitchen wall. The day's plan, errands, chores, shifted into evidence codes. Detectives had enough to slow down, to map relationships, to interview the ex thoroughly, on tape, with contemporaneous notes. That did not happen in a meaningful way. A quiet burial of the lead followed. The file, with its burglary spine, went to shelves. Boxes stacked. Time passed. For the family, grief hardened into a kind of investigative patience. They asked again. They wrote letters. They tracked who held the file. They noticed when new detectives cycled in. The answer rarely changed. No new developments. The trail is cold. We are doing what we can. Cold cases do warm with technology, but they cool with bureaucracy. Years turned into more than a decade. The city moved on. The couple's friends married, divorced, had children. John carried a private guilt that survivors often feel, replaying choices, rewriting arguments, wondering about phone calls he took and the ones he did not. The ex moved up in the department, commendations on the wall. No one, officially, connected the present to the past in the file. A new century arrived, and DNA got smaller. Labs needed less material. STR profiling matured. Cold case units formed, staffed by detectives who liked puzzles more than politics. The bite mark swab, sitting quiet in storage, now had a voice. And with that, the narrative would finally face a test it had evaded for years. By the late 1990s, the science had caught up to the evidence. The bite mark swab, sealed and stored, went from archival artifact to testable clue. Analysts extracted a profile using STR technology, short tandem repeats, the repeating segments that form a kind of barcode for identity. What emerged was decisive. The contributor was female. For a file built on a two-male burglary theory, this was not a nuance, it was a collision. Cold case detectives, drawn to contradictions, reopened the box. If the offender was female, what did that say about motive? About the bite? About the staging? In an era when databases were growing and cross-agency cooperation improved, they started with relationships, not strangers. Who, in Sherri's orbit, could have been in the home, fought at close range, and left a bite? The psychology of the moment is important. Female on female homicide, particularly with a bite, pointed to personal rage. They mapped names from the original circle, friends, co-workers, neighbours, and then the nexus, John's past. The ex-girlfriend who had appeared before the wedding, who had shown up at the workplace and at the door. A name that had been uttered in the early days, then softened into rumour. Stephanie Lazarus, now an established Los Angeles Police Department detective with a solid career trajectory, assigned to an art theft unit known for complex, prestigious cases. What stands out now, in retrospect, is how close the name had always been to the file. Hiding in plain sight is not poetic. It describes cases where the proximity of a suspect discourages scrutiny. The detectives worked quietly. If Lazarus was the source of the DNA, tipping her off risked evidence loss, alibi coordination, or institutional interference. They kept the circle small, minimized paper trails, and avoided electronic queries that might ping internal systems. They began with discreet checks that did not require alerts. Service weapon logs. Had she, in the mid-1980s, carried a .38 revolver? Many officers did. The department had transitioned through calibers and platforms over the years, but archives showed she had access to .38 ammunition in that era. That did not prove anything. It placed her in a category. They layered timelines, her academy dates, patrol assignments, and days off against the murder date. No conflict appeared that cleared her. Instead, her schedule left open windows. Parallel to that, they reviewed the original investigative packets for any mention of her. They found hints, family statements recalling an Officer X, anecdotal notes, yet nothing formal enough to qualify as an interview. That absence read as a red flag. If she had been thoroughly vetted in 1986, the file would have reflected it. Instead, the gap suggested deference or avoidance. And yet, for all this, they needed more than inference. They needed DNA in her name. The suspect list narrowed with every screen. A jealous co-worker? Unlikely. Nursing schedules did not align. A neighbour? No female neighbour had documented friction with Sherri. An acquaintance from John's circle? Interviews did not surface a woman with motive and means. The clandestine list kept collapsing until it sat on one name. Even then, the detectives understood the stakes. Accusing a colleague, especially one embedded in the same building, meant controlling leaks, building redundancy, and safeguarding the lab process from challenge. They consulted the lab about sample quality. The bite swab produced a robust profile, suitable for direct comparison, not just inclusion or exclusion. That mattered. In court, a partial or degraded profile invites ambiguity. A strong one anchors the narrative. The next step required a covert collection from Lazarus, abandoned DNA that could be lawfully obtained without her knowledge. Coffee cups, straws, napkins, everyday items that carry cells as reliably as fingerprints carry oils. Before making a move, they ran a risk analysis. If they approached her prematurely, she could assert rights, demand counsel, and the case might stall in procedural battles. If they told the wrong supervisor, gossip could circulate and the suspect could adjust routines. So they compartmentalized. Off-site meetings, hard copy notes hand-carried, not emailed, a small cadre only, each with defined roles. Meanwhile, they quietly verified ancillary details, past relationships, any documented injuries around the time of the murder, any contemporaneous reports that matched unusual behavior. What nobody knew at the time, outside that circle, was that the case had shifted from a question, who killed Sherri, to a narrower, heavier question. Could a sworn officer have done this and walked the halls for decades? The answer required discipline. No shortcuts, no premature confrontations, no narrative leaps that could be exploited by defense later. They also faced a contradiction that had to be managed carefully. The burglary story, still embedded in the file's public shape, would be used to challenge them. If the scene looked like a break-in, why fixate on a former girlfriend? The DNA profile was their bridge. It transformed a speculative motive into an evidentiary path. A female contributor at a bite mark is not background noise. It is a signature, so they rehearsed what would follow a match. Search warrants for home, vehicle, and work locker. Warrants for diaries, calendars, firearms purchase records, and any evidence of travel or medical treatment around 1986. They drafted affidavits in neutral language, anticipating scrutiny by judges wary of intra-departmental cases. Every assertion needed source support. Every inference needed a factual rung beneath it. Across those weeks, Lazarus kept working cases, briefing supervisors, and testifying in court about art thefts and insurance fraud. From her perspective, nothing had changed. From theirs, everything had. The plan was set. To confirm identity, they needed her DNA without alerting her, without noise, without error. A coffee cup in a public place would be enough, but getting it, and proving chain of custody beyond reasonable doubt, would require precision they could not afford to miss. Surveillance began with routine. Detectives parked far enough to avoid familiar faces, close enough to track patterns. Lazarus's days were predictable. Briefings in the morning, case reviews at her desk, a midday stop at the building cafeteria, then either the gym or field contacts. The psychology of the moment is important. She was a veteran detective on home turf, comfortable, unworried, moving with the confidence of someone who believed danger came from outside, not from a shadow 3 tables away. They rehearsed handoffs like choreography. One team tracked ingress and egress, one watched the trash cans, one sat with a clear line to whatever she touched. They avoided radios, relying on preset signals such as shoulder taps, folded newspapers, or a slow rise from a chair. What stands out now in retrospect is how ordinary the setting was. A tray, a paper cup, a straw, the small objects that carry DNA as quietly as dust carries light. She ordered coffee, no lid at first, added sweetener, then snapped the lid on. That mattered. Saliva on the rim, epithelial cells on the straw. She sat with 2 colleagues, talking work, an art theft lead, a shipment flagged at a port. Her voice carried just enough for the watchers to note cadence, not content. After 10 minutes, she stood, tossed the cup, and left for the elevator. But here is the twist. The cafeteria had custodial staff who cleared tables fast. A civilian touching the cup could complicate chain of custody. The team had positioned a customer, already standing near the bin. As Lazarus dropped the cup, the decoy set a napkin on top to mark it. Seconds later, a detective stepped in, gloved up, and retrieved the cup, the straw, and the napkin she had used. Each item went into pre-labeled evidence envelopes, sealed with initials, date, and time. Photos captured the bin, the cup, the retrieval, and the applied seals. Chain of custody starts at the moment of contact, and they built it like a ladder with no missing rungs. They did not celebrate, They did not talk. The runner left the building with a bland tote bag, walked 2 blocks, and slid into an unmarked car. From there, straight to the lab. No detours, no stops. Logged arrival time against cafeteria surveillance timestamps. A second set of eyes witnessed intake, because redundancy undercuts defense attacks later. In forensic work, you assume the defense will probe every inch for contamination, so you build in witnesses the way architects add reinforcement to beams. Meanwhile, the tail stayed on Lazarus. If she deviated, if she took a sudden personal day, if she made calls that suggested suspicion, they would know. Instead, she moved through her afternoon, spoke with a museum registrar, typed notes, and headed to the gym. She wiped her face with a towel from the rack. The team let it go. One collected sample is enough if it is clean. More can help, but more also amplifies the chances for a defense to allege a planting opportunity. At the lab, analysts prepared the comparison. The bite mark profile from storage, now digitized and verified, sat in the system. The cup rim, the straw, and the napkin were processed separately to avoid cross-transfer in handling. STR markers, D3, VWA, FGA, and the rest, were developed, peaks aligning into a pattern like a barcode. The first run matched across multiple loci. A second run confirmed it. Statistical weight landed in the numbers. The probability of a random, unrelated individual sharing this profile was effectively microscopic. They had a source. They had her. The call to the case lead was short. We have got it. No adjectives. No speculation. Just the fact that the DNA on the bite mark matched the DNA from Lazarus's discarded items. In that moment, the ethical weight settled. Arresting a colleague is not just procedural, it is cultural, it is psychological. Leaks could tip her. Sympathy from the wrong office could slow things down. Therefore, they compartmentalized further. They scheduled off-site briefings in a borrowed room miles from headquarters. Warrant packets were drafted for her home, her vehicle, and her work locker. Judges were selected carefully, neutral, known for scrutinizing affidavits rigorously. The language in the affidavits was clinical. A homicide in 1986, a preserved bite swab, a female DNA profile, a covert collection from the suspect, match confirmed by independent runs. No color, no flourish, nothing for a defense to call prejudice. They also planned the arrest with safety and optics in mind. She often carried, but departmental rules barred firearms in certain interview settings. The pretext would be an art theft consultation in a secure room, no gun on her hip, a controlled environment, medical staff on standby, not because they expected violence, but because best practice anticipates stress reactions such as panic spikes, fainting, or hypertension. Please leave a like and subscribe for daily true crime stories. The hallway route was mapped. The team assigned roles: contact, cuff, transport, property, notifications. While that was happening across town, a different team prepped for immediate searches to prevent destruction of evidence. The window between arrest and knowledge spreads fast. They could not afford delay. The coffee cup had delivered the secret. Now, the room would deliver the truth they needed to hear, or the silence that would speak just as clearly. She arrived without her sidearm. The pretext was simple. Routine. Art theft wanted her perspective on a peculiar case, a favor between units. The room was neutral. Plain walls. A table. 3 chairs. Wired without fanfare. She walked in casual, practiced smile. The bearing of a detective who had spent years guiding others through interviews. Not being the subject of one, rapport came first. Coffee offered, declined. They asked about her career arc, patrol, promotions, standout recoveries in art theft. She talked smoothly, detail by detail, the kind of specificity that builds credibility. A painting traced through a storage locker, a museum liaison who finally trusted her after months of patience. They nodded, just colleagues trading notes. The psychology of the moment is important. People relax when the topic is their expertise, their wins. Then the conversation tilted. They asked about college, friends from that era, anyone who stayed in touch. She obliged, names and anecdotes, a light laugh at a memory. They asked about relationships in those years. She mentioned nothing dramatic, just dating like everyone else, moving on as careers took over. What stands out now in retrospect is how easily she occupied the role of helpful colleague, cooperative, alert, composed. Do you remember John Ruetten? The name landed softly. A beat. Sure, she said, tone even. A small nod. We were close in college, stayed friends a while. Her hands stayed open on the table, no fidgeting. And Sherri Rasmussen? Another beat, shorter nod. He married her, right? Nurse? The phrasing was careful, observational, not personal. They let that sit, then asked if she had ever met Sherri. She exhaled lightly. Maybe once. I might have. It's been a long time. The hedge began. Did you visit their home? I don't really remember going inside. Maybe I dropped something off. Can't say for sure. The language softened every edge. Maybe. Might have. Can't say. They did not confront. They layered context. We've spoken to people who remember you going to the hospital where Sherri worked. She shrugged. I could have. I knew a lot of folks. I might have stopped by. And the condo? There was a conversation at the door. A small smile, almost self-deprecating. If I did, it would have been to wish them well, nothing more. I was moving on. But the eye contact narrowed. The shoulders tightened a fraction. They asked about tension. Was there any friction between you and Sherri? No, she said quickly, then slowed, adjusted. I mean, we were adults. I wasn't trying to cause problems. She volunteered a narrative. She and John had been off and on. Then he chose marriage. She respected it. The simplicity sounded practiced. Investigators considered how simple stories often erase complexity. They moved to the month of the murder. Do you remember where you were in February 1986? She paused longer. Not really. It's decades ago. They referenced a recorded note about a leg injury she had mentioned to someone later, a bruise or a bite from a suspect on a case around that time. She tilted her head. I've had a lot of injuries. It's police work. It was an answer that acknowledged nothing and everything. Did you own a .38 revolver then? She nodded. Most of us did. Department issue at points. And privately too. Do you still have it? I don't remember specifics from back then, she said. I had different firearms over the years. The investigators did not press the retailer or serial yet. They logged the familiarity and the distance. They asked if she knew about the murder details. Only what anyone might have heard. Tragic, burglary gone wrong. Her phrasing mirrored the old file. They kept their faces neutral. Did you ever speak with John after Sherri's death? We may have talked, yeah, to offer condolences. I mean, that would be normal. How often? I can't recall. Today, while the shift now was deliberate. Some people said you had trouble letting go. The air thinned. She leaned back, a defensive posture masked as casual. People say things. One described you as upset after the engagement. Upset? I mean, sure. Disappointed. Who wouldn't be? She smiled again, tighter. But that's life. You move on. They asked about her presence at the condo. Did you ever enter the home? I don't think so. Did you ever confront Sherri at the door? A longer pause. Confront? No. If I talked to her, it would have been cordial. I'm not a confrontational person. They let the line hang. The room's hum, the air conditioner, the weight of silence. These are tools too. The forensic pivot stayed concealed. They did not say DNA. They did not reference the bite. Instead, they watched for knowledge only the killer would carry. There were some unusual elements at the scene, one said, almost offhand. Like what? She asked, tone curious, a little impatient. Just things that suggested the story wasn't straightforward. I'm not sure what you're implying, she said, voice firmer. Stephanie, if we asked for a sample today, would you consent? She blinked. A sample? Buccal swab, to rule you out. A half laugh, disbelieving. Why would you need my DNA? This is absurd. It would resolve questions cleanly. I'm not giving you a swab without talking to a lawyer, she said, the detective voice returning, measured and hard. And I don't appreciate where this is going. They eased off, then pressed laterally. Did you ever bite anyone in a struggle? She stared, incredulous. What? No. Ever been bitten around that time? I told you, police work. Anything's possible. She caught herself, changed tack. But I don't recall anything like that. Her body language tightened further, arms crossed, chin set, gaze fixed. The hospitable colleague role had eroded. Are you accusing me of something? We're exploring all possibilities, they said evenly. Including one that involves a police officer? She asked. Anger under control but visible. We're exploring all possibilities, they repeated. Same cadence. She asked to leave. They agreed, then stood. The hallway felt longer than it was. Two plainclothes officers waited at an angle that looked incidental and wasn't. A supervisor stepped in, voice low. "Stephanie, you're being detained." The cuffs came out gently, the words even. The rights read with the care of people who knew every syllable would be dissected later. Across the city, warrants activated. Teams moved. At her home, they collected journals, photographs, digital media, any firearm records, ammunition. From her car, fibers, trace, receipts that might anchor dates. From her locker, personal effects. Nothing ornamental to the investigation, everything potentially connective. In the interview room, the chair stayed empty, the coffee untouched, the hum constant. But here is the twist. She had offered almost nothing directly incriminating, yet the cracks had formed. Hedges against documented visits, vague denials against remembered confrontations, a refusal to provide DNA against a case that now hinged on it. They had not told her about the match. They did not need to. The room's purpose was different, to capture her calibration, her story's edges, the tells that would later collide with evidence in court. From interview room to courtroom, the long-delayed reckoning had finally begun. The prosecution built a narrative that felt painfully simple. Jealousy matured into fixation. Fixation escalated into violence. And after the killing, the scene was staged to look like a burglary. They walked the jury through the bite mark, DNA, female source, STR, matched to Stephanie Lazarus from an abandoned cup, then anchored it with the .38 revolver context that matched wound channels and the era's service sidearms. They emphasized the missing quilted blanket as a likely sound dampener, the glass pattern suggestive of interior staging, and the electronics arranged as props rather than loot. But here is the twist. The defense countered with contamination claims and a theory the bite could have been consensual from a prior encounter, which investigators considered implausible given the timing and the violent context. They argued tunnel vision. Once cold case detectives fixated on a colleague, they retrofitted the facts. They probed chain of custody on the decades-old swab, pressed the lab on protocols, and tried to fracture the certainty that the tube had survived 2019 years without compromise. Evidence sequencing mattered. The prosecutors did not start with DNA, they started with behavior. Witnesses described Lazarus's fixation after John's engagement, unannounced visits, the door confrontation, the workplace approach. Co-workers recalled volatility that tracked with personal disappointments, a temper held behind competence, then surfacing in private. Friends of Sherri spoke to fear, to the phrase, "won't let go," to warnings, said softly, because pressure lived inside the home's routine. Then the forensics returned. Blood trace mapping that charted a fight from upstairs to down, blunt force trauma that preceded shots, and the bullet path that read like re-aiming under movement. The blanket, gone. The slider's glass, inconsistent with an outside breach, valuables left behind. The pattern made sense only if the goal was not property but erasure. LAPD's institutional shadow entered the room. The jury heard about missing notes and the absence of a formal recorded interview with Lazarus in 1986. Prosecutors did not need to prove a cover-up. They only had to show how deference and bias can narrow a lens. The defense warned against convicting the department by proxy. The court instructed the jury to focus on evidence, not broader failings. The psychology of intimate violence framed motive, possession, humiliation, the bite as domination. Deliberations were deliberate, focusing on credibility of the science and the coherence of the scene. When the verdict came guilty, the courtroom held the Rasmussen family's quiet, restrained pain. The reckoning, long delayed, had a voice. In the aftermath, the institution looked inward, cautiously. Reviews acknowledged what the case exposed. When a narrative hardens early, evidence that contradicts it gets handled like noise. Cold case protocols were strengthened. Evidence retention was audited, bite and touch DNA prioritized, and reopened files required documented review of intimate partner angles. Even when the suspected partner was not a current one, the psychology of the moment is important. Policy shifts only matter if they outlast headlines. Public trust absorbed a different impact. An officer, embedded for decades, turned out to be the offender, and early warnings had been minimized. For communities already skeptical, it was not only the murder, it was the erasure. Departments talked about conflict checks when investigating insiders, about insulating sensitive inquiries from leaks by limiting digital footprints and creating off-site teams. None of that restores the lost years, but it signals that blind spots can be mapped. For the Rasmussen family, memory work never stopped. Nels and Loretta pressed letters into hands, recorded phone calls, kept timelines on legal pads, Their persistence functioned like a metronome against institutional drift. When DNA made the impossible possible, their groundwork, names, dates, patterns, gave detectives traction. Grief stabilized into advocacy, then into a quiet form of oversight that outlived retirements and unit reshuffles. Broader meaning settled into something stark. Bias narrows investigations, not only by prejudice, but by comfort, preferring patterns that cleanly resolve. Burglary felt tidy. Jealousy, especially jealousy involving a colleague, felt radioactive. Female on female homicide did not fit the template that detectives reached for first. In hindsight, the indicators were plain: overkill, humiliation, staging, yet they sat in a file that said burglary at the top. In training rooms, instructors began using the case to teach negative space. What is missing that should be there? A real burglary ring leaves informants, fences, chatter. Here, there was silence around the loot and noise in the relationship. The bite mark swab became a symbol in those lessons. A small tube that held the truth, patient and clinical, while people argued over theory. For victims' families watching, the lesson is hard but precise. Insist on the intimate angle being tested. Insist on preservation. Ask for names to be put on paper. Systems change slowly, but a single preserved trace can survive long enough to meet better science. And when it does, the past gets a second chance to speak. Story number 2. The store lights were still on when they forced the door. One woman lay dead in the back room. Another, bound at the wrists and ankles, said she'd survived. She whispered about 2 masked men, slipping in after closing, taunting them, destroying everything. But something felt wrong. The alarms had been quiet. The register was untouched. Keys sat where they should. Officers listened to a story of torture and chaos. Let's get to it. But here's the twist. Details didn't behave like real robberies. Jayna Murray didn't drift into that store. She had goals stacked neatly, the way merchandise sat folded on the wall, graduate studies in business and communications, a social circle that relied on her steadiness, a family that loved her momentum. Friends described weekends packed with plans and early morning runs, the kind of discipline that made sense inside a brand that marketed control, breadth, and balance. At work, she was dependable, the closer you trusted to lock up right. The psychology of the moment is important. Retail at night has a rhythm. Closing procedures become ritual. Count the cash. Reset displays. Check the bathrooms. Lock the back door. Pull the front gate. In this location on Bethesda Row, the rituals felt reinforced by the neighborhood itself. The street is curated. Upscale facades. Boutique signs. A constant sense of being observed. Surveillance cameras watch sidewalks, not because violence is expected, but because order is part of the purchase. Employees believed in that order. You can hear it in the way people talk about closing with a partner. 2 sets of keys, 2 sign-offs, a checklist that creates a shared bubble of safety. Inside, the aesthetic sold calm, yoga as a worldview. At the time, late-night patterns were predictable. Neighboring restaurants emptied gradually, pedestrians thinned to a few quiet couples, delivery trucks rumbled through, and most storefronts went dark on schedule. On Jayna's last day, there were normal frictions. Customer returns, sizing requests, a complaint about a discount that wouldn't apply. Nothing unusual. She worked the floor, stepped into the back room to check inventory, answered a call, joked with a co-worker, and prepared to close. After final customers left, there was a small issue about an item, a phone call. Then, a decision to return to the store after hours to sort it out, brief, practical, the kind of thing conscientious employees do to keep small problems from becoming bigger ones. In hindsight, the final text exchange sits heavy. Casual tone, a quick, "be right back," no alarm in the words. That's how ordinary danger often looks, masked by routine. In a space built to project serenity, risk didn't announce itself. It moved quietly, under fluorescent lights. Meanwhile, the larger neighborhood drifted toward midnight. Security cameras captured passing headlights, a jogger's silhouette, a delivery van double-parked, then gone. Inside the store, closing procedures should have been complete. Cash counted, doors secured, alarms armed. That was the expectation. What stands out now, in retrospect, is that expectation itself. The belief that the brand's order could hold back human chaos. For Jayna, the relationships mattered as much as the work. She'd planned trips, checked in with family, kept a steady cadence with friends. That day ended with the small, dutiful acts that make teams function. A return, A check, a lock. It takes only one disruption to break a pattern that's held 100 times before. To understand the story told later, we need to see who could tell it. Two women walked back into a quiet store on a quiet street. By morning, only one voice would remain to explain what happened in the hours between. Brittany Norwood's voice was low, almost hoarse. She said they'd been done for the night when two men slipped in, masks, dark clothes, one taller than the other. She added racialized descriptors that tapped a familiar fear: urban, predatory, anonymous. According to her, they moved like they'd done this before. One grabbed Jayna, the other threw Brittany down. Zip ties bit into her wrists. She said they joked about how soft the store felt, how rich people shopped here, how easy it would be to take everything. No forced entry. That was the first fracture. The front door's lock showed no pry marks, no splintering, no warped latch. The back door, the one employees trusted, was intact. Door mechanics matter, because a forced rush usually leaves scars. Metal burrs, paint flakes, deformed strike plates. Here, nothing. The alarm panel, seated beside the entrance, wasn't smashed or tampered with. It looked as if closing happened correctly, or, at minimum, entry wasn't violent. For investigators, that undercut the idea of masked men forcing their way in after hours. Cash remained. Registers were opened, yes, but drawers weren't emptied. Electronics sat close to outlets, disconnected, placed rather than ripped. Inventory chaos read like a gesture, not a path of exit. Stacks disturbed without a trail leading to a door. Grabbing and going is messy in predictable ways. Toppled racks near access points, a funneling of movement toward the quickest escape. Instead, the disorder looked distributed for effect, like someone had walked through and planted signs of a robbery without the follow-through. The shoe prints told a quieter story. Technicians lifted repetitive patterns in blood. Same tread, same size. Repeated across zones. Staging often trips on footwear because genuine movement introduces variability. Overlapping sizes, inconsistent pressure. The smudge of a pivot. Here, prints landed cleanly and reappeared as if stamped, not improvised. Investigators considered that one person could have stepped into the blood and then paced out their own narrative, careful where to land, creating the illusion of multiple bodies moving at speed. Blood spatter resisted the claimed motion. Cast off on walls suggested blows delivered from consistent angles, not the chaotic signatures of two attackers switching positions. Contact transfer. Smears where a body or object touched contradicted the alleged dragging between rooms. If Jayna had been moved in the way Brittany described, the pattern would arch, drip, and smear along expected vectors, floor to hip, to shoulder height, then back again. Instead, patterns clustered near where the worst violence occurred, with limited transport evidence. The scene spoke to concentration, not roaming. Time stamped the fiction. Receipts and a closing checklist fixed the evening in numbers. Phone activity created windows. Brief bursts, gaps, then pings again. Investigators mapped these timelines like grids, overlaying one device with another. Brittany's account required long spans of continuous threat, yet the digital trail showed pauses that didn't fit constant motion. In those pauses, there was likely staging, moving shoes, arranging damage, and setting the bindings that would later cue victimhood. Bindings failed the scrutiny of proximity. The cuts on Brittany were shallow, the kind forensic nurses called tentative or superficial. Zip ties were present, but the knotting on tape and the residues suggested control at key moments. Enough to produce marks, not enough to disable a person without options. The feasibility of self-application isn't hypothetical, it's tested. Could a person bind their own wrists in front, slip them behind, then secure ankles with slack to allow later movement? With time and repetition, yes. The knot types and adhesive placement hinted at practice, not surprise. A micro-story emerged from the floor. A single, clean footprint in blood that led to no functional destination. It ended near a display, an island with no exit. Staging leaves signatures like that, impractical prints that exist to be seen. Real intruders make tracks to leave quickly, tracks that degrade near doors, not decorate the middle of the scene. Then there was the silence where theft should shout. Loss prevention professionals expect missing high-value items consistent with how thieves prioritize. Small, expensive, easy to resell. Inventory didn't reflect that pattern. Instead, a scatter of mid-level items had been disturbed, with no evidence of systematic bagging. Electronics, the universal currency of quick theft, stayed. This wasn't greed, it was theatre. If the story collapses, motive must rise to fill the space. Investigators turned to what could turn a routine, closing into a killing without a break-in. That meant looking inward, toward policy, toward relationships on shift, toward any conflict that might have escalated. The configuration of violence, concentrated and repetitive, sounded like rage close at hand, not punishment from strangers. What nobody knew at the time, outside the room of analysts and detectives, was how quickly the scene had started to point away from intruders. It wasn't one piece that broke the tale. It was a mosaic of quiet rejections. The lock that wasn't bent, the cash that wasn't taken, the blood that didn't travel, the prints that repeated like a pattern on a stamp. Each detail refused the narrative, and together they made belief untenable. She described the entry as a simple rush, a door nudged before the lock settled. No broken glass, no splintering wood, because, she said, they were quick. Then the taunts began. They talked about money, about women who don't know real life, about a brand that sold a dream. Brittany said she heard Jayna's voice arguing, trying to reason, offering codes, begging them to go. It was a chilling narrative, full of power and humiliation, and it gave the officers a frame. Stranger danger in a luxury space. The claimed sequence lasted hours. She spoke of being dragged from one room to another, of bindings tightened and loosened, of insults that sounded rehearsed, the kind of lines that echo from movies about home invasions. She said they hit Jayna again and again, moving between stockroom and sales floor, shoving displays, cutting fabric, scattering hangers. She said one man assaulted her, then stopped, distracted by something in the back. Meanwhile, the other kept up a running commentary about Bethesda's money and how nobody could stop them. Staging elements were embedded in her story, without using that word. Zip ties were found, bindings cut, then reapplied. Brittany mentioned tape, a roll that kept losing its edge, gloves tossed aside, a trash bag half filled, then abandoned. She said they tied her to a toilet fixture at one point, then moved her again, threatening to come back if she made a sound. They left messages by implication, destroyed displays and selective chaos, a nod to robbery, but almost curated. What stood out was what sounded performative. Electronics unplugged but not taken, cash drawers opened but not emptied, a scattering of small items that wouldn't matter to professionals. She said the men were unpredictable but careful, constantly warning that any scream would mean worse punishment. She described their steps as heavy, the air chemical, metallic, yet when pressed for sensory detail, the exact words, the textures, her cadence flattened, details clipped away. Investigators listened for trauma's rhythm. In real accounts, victims often veer into asymmetry, unnecessary specifics about smells, a sound that won't leave, a small object noticed under stress. Brittany's language hit the beats of a constructed scene. Entry, domination, taunts about status, sexual threat, property damage, escape. When she paused, it wasn't because a hard memory surfaced. It was to reposition the plot. Why did the story appeal? It matched a cultural script. The luxury store paradox. Spaces that sell composure can feel like targets. People fear the random attack, the masked villain who punishes wealth on principle. Her narrative soothed something unspoken. It could be anyone, so nobody inside the circle was to blame. In neighborhoods like this, the worst threat is imagined as arriving from outside, shadowed, unknowable. But the details had friction. She said alarms were irrelevant because they'd forced the door with speed. Yet alarms depend on sensors, not pace. She said they wanted money, yet cash remained. She said they moved a lot, but patterns weren't consistent with 2 bodies plus 2 victims. Even then, the psychology of the moment bought her time. Officers are trained to treat the living as victims first, especially when they're bound, injured, whispering about sexual assault. It's human, and it's right, to listen. Still, forensic evidence is indifferent to a good story. While Brittany spoke, technicians recorded positions, distances, and stains. They noted the drift of footprints and the shape of blood on the wall. The narrative had tensile strength, enough to hold for hours, but it would meet measurements, not impressions. And those measurements, patient and precise, were already waiting to disagree. Brittany Norwood came across as capable. Co-workers saw charm paired with competence, a teammate who could close, who could talk customers through sizing, who fit the brand's polished tone. Yet her work history showed short tenures, quick exits, and small tensions that never quite resolved. There were disciplinary whispers, Missed shifts explained with confidence, inventory discrepancies that prompted quiet checks, moments where managers felt the need to watch rather than trust. In retail, that's not unusual, but patterns matter when the stakes change. Internal theft concerns had begun to orbit her name before that final night. Loss prevention procedures in stores like this are straightforward. Track high-value items, log try-ons, confirm returns, conduct bag checks sensitively but consistently. Management had been vigilant, especially when certain pieces seemed to vanish without the usual paperwork. The theory was always handled carefully. Assume error, confirm with data, avoid accusations without proof. Still, Brittany had drawn attention. Not a formal write-up, but a raised eyebrow. A note in a manager's head. The catalyst arrived in a small, predictable package. Suspected shoplifting. An item flagged during closing. A question asked. A request to verify. A confrontation, if you can call it that, about whether a piece had been taken or just misplaced. Then that decision to return to the store with Jayna after hours, to clear it up. The psychology of the moment is important. Shame and anxiety can expand fast when exposure looms. In a prestige space where the brand projects success, the fear of status loss, erasure, being seen as a thief, can feel existential. Investigators considered a common pattern. When a manageable issue threatens identity, some people escalate. Instead of accepting a minor consequence, they scramble for narrative control. The story becomes the defense, built quickly, with props and implications, to drown out the original problem. Brittany, under pressure, had reason to fear a conversation she could not control. If Jayna had discovered evidence of theft, or insisted on reporting it up the chain, Brittany's position at work and her self-image would collapse. Known patterns of improvisation under panic often involve overcorrection. Rather than a measured denial, there is a swing toward grander claims. Strangers, invasion, menace that explains everything except the core issue. Creating a powerful enemy can erase a petty motive. If masked men did it, then no one inside the circle did. If chaos ruled, then nothing under her control mattered. It is the psychology of staging, to reassert control by rewriting the origin of the violence. But here is where Brittany's profile sharpened. Her charm was not an act. She could be warm, persuasive, present. That quality gave her confidence in conversation, even under scrutiny. In interviews, she leaned on specificity where it served her, then thinned out when asked about logistics. She displayed defensive specificity, exact phrasing about taunts, vague responses about entry mechanics. The contrast suggested a scripted spine, supported by improvisation when pressed. Microstory. Earlier that evening, there was the callback to retrieve a forgotten item, framed as simple, quick. Jayna agreed, because that is what conscientious colleagues do. A small decision that spiraled. From the outside, it looks like a hinge with no weight. But for Brittany, the return created a new problem. How to manage whatever Jayna would find, or had already found. In hindsight, the pivot from ordinary workplace friction to irreversible harm likely happened in minutes, governed by panic more than plan. There is another layer. Financial and social pressures beyond the store. Young adults balancing rent, image, and family expectations can feel squeezed, especially in affluent environments where appearance carries currency. If Brittany had debts, if she was maintaining a certain look, the temptation to skim products or discounts can start small. What stands out now in retrospect is how quickly a fear of being unmasked can overpower judgment. The risk calculus changes. The immediate threat is not the law. It is humiliation and loss of belonging. The need for narrative control became visible in the scene itself. The intruder story did not just protect Brittany from legal culpability, it insulated her from social collapse. It transformed a suspected theft and a confrontation into a random act of violence, where she, too, was a victim. In that frame, co-workers would not feel betrayed. They would feel sympathy. The lie tried to preserve her place in a community that values trust and composure. Investigators mapped her responses against this pressure. When asked about policies, who holds keys, how alarms work, her answers floated. When asked about feelings, fear, sounds, pain, Brittany slipped into generic trauma language. But when the topic moved to Jayna's attitude or the workplace's fairness, Brittany became crisp, grounded. The psychology of the moment is important here. People under accusation often argue the moral case, not the physical one. They want you to understand why they are not the kind of person who would do this, rather than how the events could have happened. With a motive forming, the scene's strange specificity became a map. Each selective disturbance, each curated mess, pointed to someone who knew the store's rhythms and vulnerabilities. Only an insider would stage a robbery that left high-value items and barely touched the safe. Only someone familiar would assume the mask of an outsider would be believed. Brittany Norwood stood inside that Venn diagram. Access, anxiety, and the strongest incentive to rewrite the night. The murder weapons told a story of proximity and improvisation. Investigators documented multiple instruments: a rope, at least one box cutter, a wrench-like implement, and a merchandising bar common to retail displays. None were brought from outside. They were tools at hand, selected as the violence escalated, then discarded nearby. That matters. Organized home invaders carry their tools. Opportunists use what is available. Here, the sequence suggested a single decision-maker in a confined rage, testing implements, returning to the body, then switching again when fatigue or breakage changed the mechanics of harm. Wound analysis reconstructed the cadence. Jayna's injuries were not random punctuations. They clustered by height and angle. Forensic pathologists mapped arcs of cast-off to infer directionality. Repetitive, downward blows from a consistent stance created curved stains on adjacent surfaces, like a metronome's track captured in droplets. Overkill is a clinical word for what looked like fixation. Dozens of impacts, some defensive, some executional, delivered in bursts rather than a free-for-all. The pattern suggested pauses, moments when the attacker stepped back, repositioned, selected a new instrument, and resumed, a cycle more compatible with one perpetrator than two, taking turns without leaving overlapping signatures. Vehicle clues added a quiet contradiction. Jayna's car had been moved from a parking spot, then returned to a nearby location, without the abrupt tire marks expected in a frantic escape. Trace transfer in the footwell showed residue consistent with the store's flooring compounds, and a fine mist of blood, present in microscopic quantities along a threshold, suggested contact during shoe removal or entry after exposure. If masked intruders needed a getaway car, why take the victim's vehicle for a short, controlled relocation instead of disappearing? Investigators considered a different purpose: to create an illusion of flight, then walk back to the scene to finish the staging. Clothing and footprints were just as telling. Clean areas existed where contamination should have been inevitable. Rectangles of untouched surface amid wide swaths of blood, as if an item had been placed to mask contact, then removed. The stage stepping was obvious to trained eyes. A single tread pattern repeated through zones with uniform pressure, no scuffing on turns, and improbably neat edges at thresholds where real speed produces smears. In one corridor, prints alternated left-right, with textbook spacing, like a demonstration, not a scramble. Meanwhile, other pathways, those necessary for entrance and exit, were strangely pristine. Digital breadcrumbs refused the timeline. Calls and texts created a lattice of minutes, a network of pings that contradicted a night of unbroken terror. There were small islands of phone silence when the scene building likely occurred, followed by bursts of activity too regular for someone bound and under immediate threat. Search histories and auto-updates added texture. Devices do not lie about their own metabolism. Investigators synchronized activity across phones and local towers, finding windows where Brittany's version demanded chaos. But the network showed calm. DNA and trace evidence carried more absence than presence. No unknown male profiles surfaced where Brittany said they should. On bindings, on tools, on the fabric she said was handled by gloved hands that tore, then slipped. Transfer from a second attacker should have appeared in partials, on edges of tape, or at knot compressions, where skin cells collect. Instead, profiles mapped to the two employees and workplace background. The expected artifacts, the detritus of strangers, were missing. A microstory hid in the adhesive. The leftover roll of tape, found with its leading edge folded neatly under, a trick people use to restart tape quickly, carried smudged, partial ridge detail under the stick, not on its outermost wraps. That suggests local handling during the staging, then careful concealment. In the trash, discarded segments of tape showed fingerprints that had been wiped rather than naturally degraded. Adhesive residues linger on skin and surfaces, fluorescing under certain light, and led technicians to a sink that had been run briefly, insufficient to erase the chemistry. What stands out now in retrospect is the room's logic. The murder weapons arrayed in proximity, the limited spatter radii, the regular footprints, the tidy electronics, the sham burglary, the vehicle's short migration, the phone's unnatural cadence, each betrayed an authorial hand trying to write fear onto a floor. Meanwhile, The victim's defensive wounds, concentrated on hands and forearms, mapped to an attacker standing close, not two men cycling in and out. The scene did not breathe like a robbery, it breathed like a narrative exercise that could not outrun measurement. Forensics does not care about reputations, it asks where the blood went, how gravity worked, where heat diffused, what adhesive did when it met skin oils. It builds a picture from laws of motion and the stubborn habits of materials. In this case, those habits contradicted the intruder tale with a calm, relentless voice. And with each betrayal, the survivor at the center shifted, in quiet increments, from witness to the only viable suspect. At first, detectives spoke softly, matching the tone used with traumatized witnesses. Brittany lay in a hospital bed, then sat in a quiet room at the station, a blanket around her shoulders. The interview cadence was gentle, open-ended, designed to let details surface. She repeated the same scaffolding. Two men, masks, insults about wealth, a night that would not end. But with each retelling, small pieces drifted. Entry mechanics changed by a beat. The order of threats slid. A taunt moved from the sales floor to the back room. Trauma can rearrange memory, yes. But here the rearrangement always benefited the narrative. They asked pivot questions. How did the door open if the lock was engaged? How did the bindings tighten and loosen without injury consistent with sustained restraint? What exact minute did she find an escape if she never moved more than a few feet? Brittany supplied defensive specificity. She remembered a word-for-word insult, but not which door sensor chirped. She remembered the smell of a cleaner, but not which light was on. When asked where the intruders stood during a particular blow, left or right, she said both, then neither, and then the line went quiet. Investigators introduced one impossible fact at a time: a shoe print that matched a store stock size, not a common outside brand. A cast-off pattern that required a consistent attacker position, not rotating bodies. A phone ping in a window when she claimed her hands were immobilized. They did not accuse. They placed the facts on the table, waited, and watched the narrative fracture. Brittany's voice thinned. She shifted to the moral frame. She would not do this. She could not. But the room had moved from character to physics, and physics did not flinch. Behavioral tells collected in the gaps. When asked about pain, she offered generic descriptors: hurt, burning, pressure. Without the sensory anchors survivors tend to recall: the seam of tape against hair, the cold of tile, the specific grit under a cheek. When asked how the bindings were cut, she said they were not, then said they were, then said she lost time. An experienced interviewer hears where shame sits. The psychology of the moment is important. She needed to be a victim to survive socially and legally, which meant managing what she could control, the story's edges, while avoiding its mechanical core. They began a careful reconstruction in the room, step by step, turning her own claims into demonstrations. Show us how the zip tie lay. Show us where you were when he moved the tape. Show us how your hands were placed when you sent that text. Brittany complied, then balked at points where the body's geometry exposed the lie. A wrist cannot rotate that way if the tie is back-tightened. Ankles bound as described would prevent the pivot needed to create those footprints. The demonstration turned into a quiet cross-examination of physics and anatomy. Meanwhile, detectives linked the micro-decisions that formed the staging. Shoes selected from a sales rack, placed and stepped as symbols. Electronics unplugged, then deliberately left. Tape handled, edge folded under for speed. A brief walk to the sink, water run, adhesive residue still glowing under the lamp. In that sequence, a more plausible timeline appeared. A confrontation sparked by suspected theft, sudden violence, panic, then a hurried attempt to externalize blame by manufacturing intruders who never existed. The arrest moment arrived without theatrics. Prosecutors had crossed the threshold they needed. The absence of forced entry, the coherence of wound sequencing indicating one attacker, the digital timeline undermining captivity, and the stage scene broadcasting authorship. They charged Brittany Norwood, aligning the case narrative around escalation, rather than long-planned premeditation, an improvised homicide followed by meticulous, if flawed, staging. She was moved from a survivor's chair to a suspect's custody, her blanket folded back, her wrists cuffed with care. Courtroom reality removes improvisation. There, the story would face rules of evidence, qualified experts, and jurors who would weigh craft against physics, intention against action. For detectives leaving the room, the reversal settled heavily. A chilling mystery in a sanctuary of calm had resolved not into masked men, but into a betrayal inside the circle, where fear of exposure met a need for control, and the lie, once loud, began to fall silent.